Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the season finale of The Youth Factor, where we aim to see the world through the lens of the future. I'm your host, Alex Jung, and I hope to take you on a virtual journey around the world where stories untold will be shared, current issues will be discussed, and the voices of the youth will be heard. In light of this season ending, I thank everyone for tuning into these episodes. The goal of this podcast is simple: to allow youth to share their story and allow youth to represent their proud country. I learn a whole lot from the guests, and I'm sure every listener learns something new about a country. Every country is misrepresented in some shape or form, and several countries are not well known. This podcast allows people to share experiences and perspectives in the most honest and open way. This podcast has been a project I've been extremely passionate about and enjoyed extraordinarily, and I'm looking forward to meeting all the listeners again in season 2. So several people have asked me, what exactly does Tēnā koutou katoa mean, which is how I start off every episode? Well, it means hello everyone in Te Reo Māori, the native and indigenous language of Aotearoa New Zealand, and the place I was born and raised in. A slightly different format to wrap up the season, this episode will explore New Zealand. Titled The Land of the Long White Cloud, this country is renowned for its beauty, the most stunning beaches, mountains, forests. New Zealand is a country known for its outstanding environment. It is also named one of the safest places to live in the world and proudly named the country with the friendliest people in the world. New Zealand is a diverse place with people all around the world residing together, and a special Māori culture that we cherish. The best country at rugby in the world, this country also is amazing at sports, including sailing, rowing, cricket, and more. And the ratio of humans to sheep is 1 to 5, so lamb meat is very popular and enjoyed. Aotearoa New Zealand is a proud place to call home. So today, there is no special guest host. For the first time, I will take on the role of the interviewee, but I certainly can't do this alone. I'm extremely grateful to invite Joy Chen onto the podcast to be the interviewer. Thank you so much for helping out, Joy. Can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you for inviting me to be your interviewer today, Alex. My name is Joy Chen, and I'm from mainland China, Beijing, and Hong Kong, and I go to Lipo United World College. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you so
And
much.
so let's get started. The first topic of discussion will be the high cost of living, poverty, and the housing crisis. The cost of living is undeniably increasing for New Zealanders. For example, while many Asian nations can rely on public transport due to dense populations, New Zealand's population is not very dense, and a car is almost a necessity for travel. However, gas prices rose from $1.5 per liter in 2018 to 2.6 by 2023. This demonstrates how even necessities are becoming unaffordable. What are some of the reasons for this high cost of living?
Yeah, thank you, Joy. This is weird being on the interviewee end and answering the questions, but I'll try my best. So certainly COVID-19 plays a very significant role because despite New Zealand being known for its swift COVID recovery in the beginning, and of course the WHO was commending New Zealand for being one of the first countries to get 0 cases, this was only the first and second wave. And the reality is we had one of the longest lockdowns in the world during the later waves for almost 3 months between August and December of 2021. So the cost for necessities such as food are obviously going to increase as demand exponentially increases. But also as a result after COVID, the businesses and industries that have suffered are going to continue to have to raise the prices on goods to maintain business. And with pay for jobs not significantly increasing, COVID-19 is affecting the increased cost of living. And so you highlighted the case of gas prices, right? Another factor is the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Although New Zealand is very far from both Russia and Ukraine, our gas supplies rely on Russia, like many other countries in the world. And so as we sanction Russia during this kind of invasion, the cost of gas has had to go significantly higher. And because of this, there's controversy. Whether this was a good choice or worthy price, to see almost doubling in gas prices is very debatable. However, it's undeniable that current world affairs, whether it be near us in the Pacific or out in Europe, does affect us. And when you think about the fact that no cities in New Zealand actually have a functional public transport system, this is because we have a lack of workers. We do rely heavily on cars. And finally, the rate of production for like building houses in particular, are very slow. So they are going to be much more expensive. So those are the kind of key factors for this.
Thank you for that. And as a follow-up question, who do you think are being the most heavily affected by the cost of living or heavily hit? And why are some people more vulnerable than others?
Hmm. So I think I'll kind of split it up into 2 main groups, which is going to be children and Māori and Pacifica. So first of all, New Zealand has one of the highest rates of child poverty among rich and developed nations. And this is quite a concerning reality because children and young people in Auckland are especially affected by the negative consequences resulting from this unaffordable housing market. So many people are giving up, young people are giving up on education as a result and going into work at very young ages. And oftentimes they have very little qualifications. So despite leaving school to find work, it is very difficult for them to find it. And another group that is effectively affected by this are Maori and Pacifica people, who already are having less access to healthcare services and living in areas that often have higher poverty rates. I think it's important to know while New Zealand, alongside many other kind of wealthier countries, uh, there are significant wealth gaps depending on the district and the region you live. So if you explore Auckland, where I'm from, the comparison between central Auckland, where the city is, and South Auckland, which is really just 15 minutes away, in terms of standard of living, varies very vastly. And people are more vulnerable than others due to multiple factors such as number of children they're raising. Maori and Pacifica statistically raise more children, and because of the area they're living in as well, that's underdeveloped, and the support they're actually getting from services affects kind of the level of poverty that people experience. So this is why such a high cost of living pulls down the lower end of the income spectrum more than the higher end, eventually positioning New Zealand as a country in a recession as of June 2023 and continuing to increase that wealth gap.
That's a really interesting point, and thank you for that explanation. And maybe as a follow-up question, has there been any ways where you've seen this manifest in your everyday life? The
Mm,
high cost of living,
mm.
raising prices.
Yeah, so I've been living in Auckland for pretty much my entire life. And first of all, gas prices is one thing that New Zealanders are very unhappy about. Like if you were to live in like pre-COVID 2018, a gas per liter like is $1.80. And even that was considered expensive at the time. Now when you get petrol and it's $2.80. And that is, first of all, if you kind of do the math, it's almost nearly double the cost of gas. And then because we rely so heavily on cars, it's not like we can avoid the high gas costs because public transport isn't there. So that's how it affects me individually. My mom works as a school primary teacher, elementary school teacher in central Auckland, but in a bit more maybe not the most developed area in the city. So a lot of her students are actually from South Auckland or are people living in the lower socioeconomic bands. One of the issues she sees most, as I kind of indicated, child poverty as being kind of a big issue. Many students come to school without lunches, or they come to school without any like supplies, school supplies, food. And as a result, you know, the school is trying to provide meals for students and ensuring it's possible. But actually, providing meals for students, it's not a cheap initiative. You can't do this consistently. And I think that's also affecting schools a lot because it is a basic right, so all students should have access to it. But with high cost of living, it become more and more difficult to do it. So I think in these ways, it's the small things, but they do make a very big impact. So yeah.
And moving on to the next question, we're going to talk about the housing crisis now. So the housing crisis is significant in New Zealand in almost all regions. And in April 2021, it was reported that the cost of living in Auckland rose 21.6% and in Northland 48.9% and in Gisborne 72.5%. What would you say are the implications of this and why is this a serious issue?
Yeah, I mean, just hearing those statistics, that's very scary. In a year's time, Gisborne's house prices are going up 72.5%. I mean, that, and this is the median house prices. So that's a very terrifying statistic to hear. Undeniably, house costs are increasing while average income is not. So you can see how there's going to be an imbalance there. So Auckland's house prices are on average 1.1 million New Zealand dollars. So just give like a comparison. This is around 700,000 US dollars and 5.3 million Hong Kong dollars. This is a very bizarre amount of money that has been increasing step by step, but exponentially as time goes on. And there's going to be a number of implications of this. Firstly, there are going to be less youth being financially independent. That's not going to support the growth of an economy, right? Because people should be, you know, buying their own houses after high school, after university, and being a bit more financially independent, getting jobs. And this helps growing the economy through the increased workforce. But if the average income earner cannot afford a house, then it implies a house is for the wealthy and the elite, and that is in no way true. And we're going to have a big issue of homelessness or people just not being able to buy their own houses, and this is not going to do any good for the economy at all. there is a housing shortage in New Zealand, which also contributes to this and puts more people homeless and more people in poverty because the rate of building houses is so much slower compared to other countries. We have the land for it, we just don't have the workforce for it. And another implication of this is lower quality houses are being sold for higher prices. So people who do barely scrape to afford a house, which is still very, very expensive, when you couple that with the high cost of living, the house quality is actually not that great for the amount of money they're actually putting in. So some of the news reports in southern Auckland, and even just in general New Zealand, there's houses with intense leaks, mold, and other faults, which make these houses somewhat inhabitable. And because insurance costs are expensive, it's not so easy to just cover them. And also, another important thing to consider and factor in is New Zealand's climate and position in the world. We're very vulnerable to climate change and unpredictable climates. Um, the Auckland January 2023 floods can testify this, as several houses that are really, really expensive are not up to the standard to withstand these extreme weathers and climates. And ultimately, those houses were affected heavily. When you look at this holistically, if one aspect, such as goods and services, were cheaper, yet house prices were increasing, it could still be affordable for many New Zealanders. However, when everything is increasing in price in such drastic steps, we're going to continue to see growing wealth gaps and we're going to continue to see increased poverty. And once again, the people most affected by this are going to be Māori and Pacifica. And the next political issue we discuss will give some context as to why this is the case.
Thank you for that. And moving on to the next question then. So how are different political parties approaching this issue, and are there any services in place? And why is the upcoming 2023 election crucial for this?
Mm-hmm. So this issue is very complex because actually the nature of this issue, like the cost of living, it's measurable and it's quantifiable. So if it's improving, you will see that it's improving. Statistics can support it. And I, of course, believe that no party, no political party is going to remove it. So actually, this election is more about voting for the party that can alleviate the damage. And it is a crucial election because we need to be in a state that can get back on its 2 feet after COVID, because we're still struggling from it. We also saw Jacinda Ardern resign from Prime Minister after 6 years of it. So we're going to have to see a new form of leadership. So I'll talk a bit more about the services first that are kind of helping with this issue. So there are services in place to help with the high cost of living, such as Habitat for Humanity, that help build new homes and repair homes. Kids Can, which is specifically helping children that are affected by poverty, and other government legislation. So has this been effective though? 66,500 children were out of poverty. So this is obviously a positive statistic. We're seeing more than 50,000 children out of poverty by 2022. However, that doesn't mean the issue is over. There's still a lot more left to do. So the reason why I wanted to bring up the new election, this year's upcoming election, is because many Kiwis our age will become eligible to vote. And I highly urge people to get involved because every vote does count and learn about the policies of each party so we can put the most capable government into power. So I want to kind of set out the two big parties, so the National Party and the Labour Party's kind of approach to this. I'll try not to put as much personal bias into it, but you might be able to figure it out. So the National Party has steps for dealing with the cost of living. They want to refocus the Reserve Bank on price stability, withdraw the Fair Pay Agreement legislation, income relief for taxpayers, and restoring discipline to government spending. So, in my personal opinion, these are relatively utopian ideals that are very, very difficult to implement. I completely disagree with withdrawing the Fair Pay Agreement, as this is a legislation that makes minimum terms and conditions for employment. So it essentially makes employment much easier. And we need people in more jobs, and we need to allow more diverse ranges of people, especially Maori Pacifica, those in lower income bands, to be employed in positions. So to say that we're going to get rid of a legislation that allows for people who might not have the best education, who might not have come from the most wealthiest families, and make it harder for them to get jobs, I don't see it actually having a positive implication on the government or on the economy at all. There needs to be less barriers for it. If we have more people in the workforce, the economy will increase. That is statistically proven, and that is what we're trying to aim for. On the other hand, the Labour Party also has steps for dealing with the cost of living. So they want to permanently halve public transport fares for Kiwis on low incomes, helping more Kiwis buy their first home by lifting the income and house price gaps and first home loans and grants. They're going to extend paid parental leave from 18 to 26 weeks to support parents, boosting student loan and allowance entitlements to reduce costs and pressures while studying, and boosted superannuation, which is the government payments for people over the age of retirement, which is currently 65. with payments lifting by $52 a fortnight for a single person and $80 for a couple. So immediately you can see that labor has a different approach with the specific policies because labor is targeting specific groups and trying to make separate policies for it, whereas the National Party is trying to make a bit more of a nationwide policy on all these kind of financial aspects. So in terms of the Labour Party, there's an advantage because you're having more targeted support. They're trying to help specifically students, they're trying to specifically help elderly people and try to help them. However, there are some criticisms to this that these benefits can be seen as a waste of taxpayer money because in some ways the advantages benefit some citizens while it doesn't advantage the others. So these are the kind of two main parties' opinion on this. It's subjective on what policy seems more feasible and effective, and I'm sure that people will decide based on this information. So yeah.
Thank you for the comprehensive overview, Alex. And I'm sure not too much bias came into that, so it was very, very informative.
That's good.
And now moving on to our second point of discussion is Māori-Pakeha race relations in New Zealand. Sorry if I butcher any names here.
Yeah.
And in a July 2023 poll asking, do you believe race relations are getting worse or better or staying about the same in New Zealand? 14% say it's getting better, 35% believe it's about the same, and 47% say race relations are getting worse. The rest don't know or refuse to say. In terms of Maori, the Indigenous and Native people of New Zealand, and Pakeha, the white people of New Zealand, could you please provide some context to how this relationship formed?
Mm-hmm. So this is a very serious and ongoing issue, and I think that despite things improving over the years, there's still a lot to work on. But I'll provide some kind of context between the relationship between Pakeha and Maori. So New Zealand is a colony of the British Empire, as we know. On February 6th, 1840, so this is almost 200 years ago, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which is the treaty, was signed between Maori and Pakeha. So this is the founding document of our country, kind of like the US Constitution to some extent. There is still debate whether Pakeha had deceived the Maori through incorrect translation of the document, because there was a Maori version, an English version, but how much white settlers actually knew the Maori language enough to translate the document. But regardless of this is still the principal document that affects all aspects of life reflected in 3 articles that discuss sovereignty, land, and rights. And this is now important in ensuring the Maori culture and protection is ensured in New Zealand. So this is kind of why the treaty is so important and how this is going to be affecting the relationship between Maori, Pakeha, and now the more like ethnic and racial groups that are integrated within New Zealand society.
And how is this document prevalent in modern day society? Maybe starting with education and healthcare?
So despite the article, the Treaty of Waitangi is actually not that long. When you compare it to the US Constitution, that's like Article 20, etc., etc. Treaty of Waitangi is not that long. And so actually a lot of it now is up to kind of modern day interpretation of it. So every major sector in New Zealand is required and is incorporating the treaty in some shape or form. There's criticism on whether this is effective or not, but they are having to incorporate it. So beginning with healthcare, there are several approaches to incorporate Māori rights. And this is really important because, like I indicated in the previous section about the increased cost of living and housing increased costs, and the reality is that Māori and Pacifica are very much affected to it, and they don't often get adequate access to healthcare or education on these issues. So some approaches include providing Māori self-determination in the design, delivery, and monitoring of health and disability services, achieving equitable health outcomes for Māori, which is very important, to provide for and properly resource kaupapa Māori health and disability services, and ensure that all health and disability services are provided in a culturally appropriate way that recognizes and supports the expression of haora, or health, Māori models of care. In my opinion, the best aspect is the principle of partnership, which is very important, which requires the Crown, we call it kind of the Crown as in the Pakeha people or the people of the British Empire descent, and Māori to work in partnership in the government's design, delivery, and monitoring of health and disability services. So that means that Māori must be co-designers with the Crown of the primary health system for Māori. In education sectors, the Education and Training Act of 2020 incorporates the Te Tiriti o Waitangi as well. This includes working to ensure that plans, policies, and local curriculum reflect local tikanga Māori, Mātauranga Māori, and Te Ao Māori, taking all reasonable steps to make instruction available. and Te Reo Māori and achieving equitable outcomes for Māori students, as well as all New Zealanders to have some fundamental or basic level understanding of the language and the culture. I think that's very important, and that's how we're trying to um, incorporate it into New Zealand society.
And drawing on from that aspect about potential language barriers and language understanding, why do you believe that learning Te Reo Māori is important for all New Zealanders? And how are curriculums designed to do this?
Yeah, so um, New Zealand is very multicultural, and so this is why Maori culture especially is important, and particularly learning Te Reo Māori is important. I think there's been a bit of debate over why should students be learning this? Shouldn't they be learning the core subjects like math, English, science, etc. And why is Te Reo Māori actually needed in the curriculum? But I think a lot of people sometimes forget that Te Reo Māori is an official language of New Zealand, if not the first official language of New Zealand. Yet only 7.9% of the country speak the language. This is very
Oh.
rare for an official language to be only spoken by less than 10% of the people. It is a beautiful language, and it is really sad that there's less than 10% of the people learning it. And I partially do blame the education system for not really emphasizing it, the importance of the language for students at a very young age. Another factor that affects us is we have a very large immigration population. So there's many Chinese people that came during the 1800s for the gold rush, where they're trying to extract gold from the South Island. There's a big Korean immigration population movement in the 1990s when there was a dictatorship in Korea, so many Koreans immigrated to New Zealand. We're seeing lots of Pacifica immigrants, but we have a large immigration population that also prevents further learning of this language, because when people immigrate, they don't particularly think, oh, I need to learn the kind of language of the people of the land. Despite being an immigrant, and I fully support preserving their culture, and I don't, believe that people should just assimilate to the place they emigrate to. I think it's important that people stay true to their culture. I equally think it's important to respect the land that you're actually living in as well, especially in the case of New Zealand, by learning the language and appreciating the culture. Because multiculturalism, or kind of appreciating cultural diversity, works in the way that you can bring your own culture to the country as much as you learn the other cultures, and that's how cultural integration works. Diversity doesn't just exist by having people of different cultures and then kind of being separate and buried behind it. Um, Another unique case about New Zealand is, unlike many countries, Aotearoa New Zealand is actually a land approved by the Maori to reside in, written in the treaty. So we genuinely do need to take this as a privilege and do our best to learn the language and culture, because unlike in many cases where the British Empire had perhaps beaten the indigenous people, such as in the case of Australia, where very unfortunately they did, manage to eradicate many of the Aboriginal population. So it was really under British control. New Zealand, when there was the New Zealand Wars against Māori-Pakeha, they somehow ended up in a stalemate. So Māori does have a very important part, and they should be technically playing 50% of all government decisions or policies. Of course, that's not the case, and that's something that we need to work on. Another important thing is languages are dying every day, right? It's a unfortunate reality, and what languages are particularly dying are indigenous languages, such as Te Reo Māori and lots of local tribe languages. So preserving such a sacred language that does include vocabulary such as kaitiakitanga, tangata whenua, mana, which are not translatable and actually are very sacred words. It's extremely important to preserve this, as language is a reflection of culture. So how do we actually integrate this into curriculums? In elementary schools, there are Māori language learning for all students, whether they learn the haka, they learn Māori vocabulary, they're still using the language in day-to-day life, because all students and New Zealanders are required to understand what Te Tiriti o Waitangi is and why it's important. So it's not so much about politics, right? It's not so much about do you need to understand the different parties' policies, but it's kind of important to understand the Treaty of Waitangi, because the key takeaway from it is that Māori and Pakeha hold an equal kind of position in New Zealand. And so we need to respect that. So for staff members, Te Aho o Te Reo Māori is a program designed for staff to know the basic vocabulary that can teach students, so that every student is absorbing and learning the language. This is a nationwide effort to preserve the language, as it is crucial to Aotearoa New Zealand. However, there are still some shortcomings that undeniably there are still less and less people speaking the language fluently, especially from elder generations. So I guess that was a bit of a longer response to the question, but yeah, hope I answered it.
That was very comprehensive, thank you. And actually, I'm interested. So I know that you speak quite a bit of Te Reo Māori, and I was wondering about your experience learning the language and maybe like how how you've learned this? Has it been passed down through your family or like solely from your education system?
Mhm. Well, humbly speaking, I'm not very good at Te Reo Māori. I mean, I'm probably better than most people around the world, but that's only because I grew up here. But yes, I do put a large effort into learning the language, as I said. So growing up in New Zealand as an elementary school student, we learned the haka. And that's something that honestly I can still perform to this age, day and age, and still remember it. The New Zealand national anthem has Te Reo Māori in the first verse of it, so actually you just keep speaking it. And I'll talk a bit more about it in the other question as well. But you start using Te Reo Māori kind of as substitutes for English in your day-to-day kind of society as well. So like toilet in Māori is whare paku, and I often use that term more than toilet in New Zealand. And like
Mm.
it's almost just basic vocabulary that if you was supposedly to see it in public and there's no English translation for it, you'd know what it means type vocabulary. So actually, I think it's good that a lot of New Zealanders, especially those that have been born and raised here, do have an understanding of it. Now, I'm not an immigrant, so I was born and raised in New Zealand, but my parents are immigrants. So I don't think I was particularly taught by my parents learn Te Reo Māori. And actually, my mom, who's a primary school teacher, elementary school teacher, um, she only started learning Māori as she became a teacher as well, and she's going through like Te Aho or Te Reo Māori, like the programs to teach the language. But I think that nowadays in the workplace as well, whether you get a job in labor positions or if you get in more like business positions, you are required to learn some amount of vocabulary. So it's actually affecting everyone, regardless of if you're like an immigrant or you're someone who's born and raised in New Zealand. So I think Te Reo Māori is a language that we're trying to kind of incorporate into day-to-day life so it's not forgotten. But a shortcoming of that is that people only rely upon that kind of basic level of Māori and not trying to further learn it fluently. There's not as many people who try to learn it fluently. In schools, obviously, you can't really teach a language to its fluent extent in a school curriculum unless you really take that as a subject. There are schools actually, like my mom's school, which is a very special case where they have a Pakeha education, and they also actually have a Māori division that exclusively teaches only in Te Reo Māori, which is
Mm.
very interesting. Of course, the main target of that is Māori students, of course, because they're the ones speaking it. But you do see the kind of odd case where non-Māori students are there and are learning, just fluently in Te Reo Māori. And hopefully, this is going to be a really good kind of step forward in preserving the language. But yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Thank you for sharing. And moving on to our next question. So despite the treaty Te Titiri o Waitangi in place,
Mhm.
93% Maori experience racism daily, and 96% say it affects their family or whānau, according to RNZ. So where is this issue most prevalent, and what can we do to stop this?
Mm. I think that's very unfortunate that you say 93% of Maori still experience racism, 96% affects their whānau, despite actually having, the constitution there that says Maori people have the sovereignty, Maori people have the rights in New Zealand, that this is a very vast majority of people who experience it. I really hope that these rates will decrease over time. There should not be racism against Maori, especially after actually a lot of the conflict that and racism that was experienced since the beginning of settlement, since when the Pakeha settlers came to New Zealand, they experienced the New Zealand wars. You see racism again and again and again, and you would think that after that kind of early period and after Te Tiriti o Waitangi is signed, you'd see some improvement, but this doesn't seem to be the case. Um, there have been some very ugly stereotypes viewing Maori as criminals, gangsters, and people who are uncivilized. I guess this is concerning because this is rhetoric that needs to be changed, especially in the 21st century. I mean, in the 20th century, in the 19th century, you might see some literature from kind of colonial literature that says, oh, yeah, the indigenous people are savages, the people that are uncivilized, their practices and ways are not, human. But nowadays, this should be very different, and like I can very confidently say there's many, many Maori people in very high positions of power. There's Maori in government, although there's not enough Maori in government. So they're not at all people who are uncivilized. There are Maori criminals and there are Maori gangsters, as there are similarly Pakeha criminals. There's Pakeha gangsters too. So the fact that this kind of stereotype is assigned just to Maori people, this is something that we need to change. there are actually another concerning thing is there's still a large deal of people who are even in denial that Maori hold a very important position in the country and are against even speaking the language, telling them that English is the only language, when actually realistically Te Reo is the official language of New Zealand. So I think that people are a bit of denial because there's a smaller population of Maori because New Zealand is 70 odd percent Pakeha. But that doesn't neglect the importance of Maori at all, like just because of the population number. So I think that's another factor that plays into it, into the racism that is experienced. COVID-19 is another one because Maori had lower vaccination rates than most other racial groups in New Zealand. This made them subject to blame for the prolonged lockdown periods. Like I said, there was a 3-month lockdown period. You can imagine that people are getting fatigued towards the end of it. I think living through that, for students going through school for 3 months in an online system continuously. It was also during the exam period. So students were at like highest stress. So there's a lot of stress going on for them. People are like out of work for more and more longer time. So unemployment rates are continuing, the cost of living is increasing. So this prolonged lockdown had a very big toll on kind of what we traditionally see as kind of like the unified or like the unified New Zealand where everyone kind of gets along with everyone. This was kind of that period that tested it and challenged it quite a bit. And because Maori had lower vaccination rates, and because the Ministry of Health is required to continuously share those statistics, it did make them the subject for blame. However, we do need to understand when there are sacred traditional procedures that are carried out by Maori, so they have different kind of healthcare systems, as well as the kind of lower quality access to general healthcare, it can be justified that they can have some level of skepticism towards vaccines because it is a new concept for them. And also, I think that Maori people still, to this day, feel like in some ways Pakeha had like taken advantage of their land, taken advantage of their culture. So, like in a situation like this, is it really the right thing to trust mainly Pakeha people and healthcare systems saying take the vaccination? There can be some hesitation there. However, they were framed as a target for discrimination instead of having some like understanding of, oh, these people, they might think of it in this way that might be different from other people because of the history of New Zealand and how they have their tribal kind of ways of living. But there was discrimination, which is obviously not very good. In the workplace, which is now post-COVID, pre-COVID as well, there's still racism, such as asking Maori people like, can you use a computer? Which is once again feeding into the uncivilized rhetoric. And it's really ironic because some people would come into work in an IT department and then people would ask them, can you use a computer? Well, that kind of seems like a no Sherlock type thing. And of course, this is a large toll on mental well-being. But then the sadder thing is they can't quit because if the majority of workplaces display racism towards them and being employed is particularly difficult, there's actually not that many alternatives. Another issue, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but I do want to kind of get my point across. Some places in New Zealand, such as Tauranga and the Bay of Plenty, which are known for like higher rates of racism, and it does somehow correlate with higher population or percentage of Pākehā living. These places need to stop with this kind of racism because it is affecting the country to a large extent. How we can stop this is really, really simple. And I think this is important because we are youth. And I hope that youth in general is a bit more liberal and a bit more understanding for culture. So we need to respect culture and we need to respect Maori culture in particular. So we have the potential to create generational shifts. And I believe the solution is so, so easy. And it really is just be careful of what you say and how to treat others. And I think it's also useful to use more Maori vocabulary in your day-to-day life. For example, I'm forming a habit to always refer to the country as Aotearoa New Zealand instead of just New Zealand. I know it's kind of like a change in habits, but I think it's an important one. I begin my emails with kia ora in most cases, especially if it's with New Zealanders. So I think it is important to continue using the language and make it part of your daily routine. But I am very, very hopeful we can see improvement.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's really sad to see such a high percentage of racism being experienced by Maori, and I think definitely using the language, like kind of these subtle changes, assimilating the culture is a really, really good shift.
Mm.
And now, finally, let's talk about climate change and how this affects the Pacific Islands. So the Pacific Islands are responsible for only 0.03% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Wow. And this is 50 countries, including New Zealand. There are continuous natural disasters in this region. New Zealand floods in 2023, extreme cyclones hitting Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Tonga, as well as with sea levels rising at a rate 2 to 3 times of global average, with 30 centimeters net rise since 1990. So, what would you say is the most critical issue regarding this?
Mm. Well, I think the answer is actually much more simpler than you think, because firstly, the biggest implication is homes are going to be lost as a result of this, right? People who have lived in that land for hundreds of years, where culture is embedded in the land, and actually, like in Maori situations, tangata whenua is the word for kind of like the protection of the land. Land is very, very symbolic in particularly Pacific Island nations. So when you're telling people to shift land, it means shift culture, it means shift heritage. And so culture is just continuously lost there. Development, investment, and symbols of heritage are also destroyed in the process. There are also going to be higher population densities in other countries, as what we're going to see is a mass migration movement, which will in turn increase even more severe climate passions and even more extreme emission rates. But I think, once again, the most important and critical issue is we're losing countries, we're losing people are losing their homes, and people are losing their culture. And I think that's what makes this issue such an evident issue and something that we really do need to think about.
Definitely, yeah. And lastly, is there anything you would like to say on how the international community can act on this?
Hmm. Well, first of all, I do find it quite appalling and quite frankly disappointing and upsetting that 15 nations are only producing 0.03% of the world's emissions. That's very little for very many countries. Proportionally
Mhm.
speaking, each country should be responsible for producing 0.51% of the emission rate if you were to divide the total number of countries by the amount of emissions that are being produced. Of course, that's probably not the most reliable statistic because there's difference in populations, etc., etc. But even when you add the population of the Pacific, no way it's only 0.03% that the Pacific is responsible for. Yet, 15 countries only take up this percentage. We are still the region that is affected the most. And this is the appalling reality. I hope that when people talk about sustainability, right, and they talk about climate change and they discuss they want to be activists, I highly urge them to actually think about the Pacific first, because we are the region that is most hit by it and most vulnerable. When there are
Mhm.
international conferences like COP, they need to critically and in depth talk about the situation in the Pacific, because you talk about COP and like the big conferences, and they talk about China's going to do this, America's going to do this, India's going to do this, and you kind of think, and they kind of provide arguments for and against changes in policy. But I think the big thing is like when they think, who is it going to help? Well, it's going to help us. It's going to help the Pacific Islands because we're not getting that support. The Pacific Islands are in no way, shape, or form wealthy or well off. In fact, many Pacific Islanders are living under the poverty line. But not many people know that because, first of all, we're very underrepresented in global politics and international um, affairs, but especially in this climate change issue where we do need to be kind of the center of like the fact that Kiribati as a nation is going to be most likely submerged by the year 2030. That is 7 years away from now, yet there's not enough attention for it. It is completely unfair for us to lose our homes and lose our culture as we disproportionately suffer. Which is also really ironic because Pacific Island countries, we have amazing climate policies. New Zealand is one of the best climate policies in the world. We have a ban on single-use plastic bags. So we actually, even when you go to the supermarket, not a single plastic bag is there. I know in Hong Kong, you pay a tax for having single-use
Yeah.
plastic bags, but in New Zealand, it's banned. If you want to put, items in a bag, you either bring your own one or they're in brown paper bags. Um,
Mhm.
we have taxes on landfill rubbish. If you want to put your rubbish out to be collected, you pay a tax for it. While recycling, you don't have to pay any tax. Yet other countries don't have policy regarding this, and they still keep producing mass amounts of emissions that affect us. If we want world peace and we want world sustainability, I don't think we can claim the title the world without the Pacific Islands because they're still part of Earth. So I hope that any organization that works with climate change or anything related to that is always thinking about how they can help the Pacific Islands and small changes in lifestyle habits, and this can really make a difference.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing. And this wraps up the Aotearoa New Zealand sharing.
Wow. Thank you so much, Joy, for being such a star interviewer. And this does ultimately wrap up season 1 of the Youth Factor. I hope to see you all again in season 2 with more stories shared, more youth voices heard, and more cultures represented. Ka kite ano, and thank you very much.